Progress of the infatuation during the 16th and 17th centuries. Present state of the science. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the search for the philosopher's stone was continued by thousands of the enthusiastic and the credulous. But a great change was introduced during this period. The eminent men who devoted themselves to the study totally changed its aspect and referred to the possession of their wondrous stone and elixir, not only the conversion of the base into the precious metals, but the solution of all the difficulties of other sciences. They pretended that by its means man would be brought into closer communion with his Maker, that disease and sorrow would be banished from the world, and that the millions of spiritual beings who walk the earth unseen would be rendered visible and become the friends, companions, and instructors of mankind. In the 17th century, more especially, these poetical and fantastic doctrines excited the notice of Europe. And from Germany, where they had been first disseminated by Rosenkreutz, spread into France and England, and ran away with the sound judgment of many clever but too enthusiastic searchers for the truth. Paracelsus D and many others of less note were captivated by the grace and beauty of the new mythology, which was arising to adorn the literature of Europe. Most of the alchemists of the 16th century, although ignorant of the Rosicrucians as a sect, were in some degree tinctured with their fanciful tenets. But before we speak more fully of these poetical visionaries, it will be necessary to resume the history of the Hermetic folly and trace the gradual change that stole over the dreams of the adepts. It will be seen that the infatuation increased rather than diminished as the world grew older. Among the alchemists who were born in the 15th and distinguished themselves in the 16th century, the first in point of date is John Aurelio Augerello. He was born at Rimini in 1441 and became professor of the Belles Lettres at Venice and Treviso. He was early convinced of the truth of the Hermetic science and used to pray to God that he might be happy enough to discover the philosopher's stone. He was continually surrounded by the paraphernalia of chemistry and expended all his wealth in the purchase of drugs and metals. He was also a poet, but of less merit than pretensions. His Chrysopoeia, in which he pretended to teach the art of making gold, he dedicated to Pope Leo X, in the hope that the pontiff would reward him handsomely for the compliment. But the Pope was too good a judge of poetry to be pleased with the worse than mediocrity of his poem, and too good a philosopher to approve of the strange doctrines which it inculcated. He was therefore far from gratified at the dedication. It is said that when Augerello applied to him for a reward, the Pope, with great ceremony and much apparent kindness and cordiality, drew an empty purse from his pocket and presented it to the alchemist, saying that since he was able to make gold, the most appropriate present that could be made him was a purse to put it in. This scurvy reward was all that the poor alchemist ever got either for his poetry or his alchemy. He died in a state of extreme poverty in the 83rd year of his age. This alchemist has left a distinguished reputation. The most extraordinary tales were told and believed of his powers. He could turn iron into gold by his mere word. All the spirits of the air and demons of the earth were under his command and bound to obey him in everything. He could raise from the dead the forms of the great men of other days and make them appear, in their habit as they lived, to the gaze of the curious who had courage enough to abide their presence. He was born at Cologne in 1486 and began at an early age the study of chemistry and philosophy. By some means or other, which have never been very clearly explained, he managed to impress his contemporaries with a great idea of his wonderful attainments. At the early age of 20, so great was his reputation as an alchemist that the principal adepts of Paris wrote to Cologne, inviting him to settle in France and aid them with his experience in discovering the philosopher's stone. Honors poured upon him in thick succession, and he was highly esteemed by all the learned men of his time. Melanchthon speaks of him with respect and commendation. Erasmus also bears testimony in his favor, and the general voice of his age proclaimed him a light of literature and an ornament to philosophy. Some men, by dint of excessive egotism, manage to persuade their contemporaries that they are very great men indeed. They publish their acquirements so loudly in people's ears and keep up their own praises so incessantly that the world's applause is actually taken by storm. Such seems to have been the case with Agrippa. He called himself a sublime theologian, an excellent jurisconsult, an able physician, a great philosopher, and a successful alchemist. The world at last took him at his word and thought that a man who talked so big must have some merit to recommend him, that it was indeed a great trumpet which sounded so obstreperous a blast. He was made secretary to the Emperor Maximilian, who conferred upon him the title of chevalier and gave him the honorary command of a regiment. He afterwards became professor of Hebrew and the Belles Lettres at the University of Dole in France. But quarreling with the Franciscan monks upon some knotty points of divinity, he was obliged to quit the town. He took refuge in London, where he taught Hebrew and cast nativities for about a year. From London he proceeded to Pavia and gave lectures upon the writings, real or supposed, of Hermes Trismegistus, and might have lived there in peace and honor had he not again quarreled with the clergy. By their means his position became so disagreeable that he was glad to accept an offer made him by the magistracy of Metz to become their syndic and advocate general. Here again his love of disputation made him enemies. The theological wiseacres of that city asserted that Saint Anne had 3 husbands, in which opinion they were confirmed by the popular belief of the day. Agrippa needlessly ran foul of this opinion, or prejudice as he called it, and thereby lost much of his influence. Another dispute, more creditable to his character, occurred soon after, and sank him forever in the estimation of the Metzians. Humanely taking the part of a young girl who was accused of witchcraft, his enemies asserted that he was himself a sorcerer, and raised such a storm over his head that he was forced to fly the city. After this he became physician to Louisa de Savoy, mother of King Francis I. This lady was curious to know the future and required her physician to cast her nativity. Agrippa replied that he would not encourage such idle curiosity. The result was he lost her confidence and was forthwith dismissed. If it had been through his belief in the worthlessness of astrology that he had made his answer, we might admire his honest and fearless independence. But when it is known that at the very same time he was in the constant habit of divination and fortune-telling, and that he was predicting splendid success in all his undertakings to the Constable of Bourbon, we can only wonder at his thus estranging a powerful friend through mere petulance and perversity. He was about this time invited, both by Henry VIII of England and Margaret of Austria, governess of the Low Countries, to fix his residence in their dominions. He chose the service of the latter, by whose influence he was made historiographer to the Emperor Charles V. Unfortunately for Agrippa, he never had stability enough to remain long in one position, and offended his patrons by his restlessness and presumption. After the death of Margaret, he was imprisoned at Brussels on a charge of sorcery. He was released after a year and, quitting the country, experienced many vicissitudes. He died in great poverty in 1534, aged 48 years. While in the service of Margaret of Austria, he resided principally at Louvain, in which city he wrote his famous work on the vanity and nothingness of human knowledge. He also wrote to please his royal mistress, a treatise upon the superiority of the female sex, which he dedicated to her in token of his gratitude for the favors she had heaped upon him. The reputation he left behind him in these provinces was anything but favorable. A great number of the marvelous tales that are told of him relate to this period of his life. It was said that the gold which he paid to the traders with whom he dealt always looked remarkably bright, but invariably turned into pieces of slate and stone in the course of 24 hours. Of this spurious gold he was believed to have made large quantities by the aid of the devil, who, it would appear from this, had but a very superficial knowledge of alchemy, and much less than the Maréchal de Rey gave him credit for. The Jesuit Del Rio, in his book on magic and sorcery, relates a still more extraordinary story of him. One day Agrippa left his house at Louvain, and intending to be absent for some time, gave the key of his study to his wife, with strict orders that no one should enter it during his absence. The lady herself, strange as it may appear, had no curiosity to pry into her husband's secrets, and never once thought of entering the forbidden room. But a young student who had been accommodated with an attic in the philosopher's house burned with a fierce desire to examine the study, hoping perchance that he might purloin some book or implement which would instruct him in the art of transmuting metals. The youth being handsome, eloquent, and, above all, highly complimentary to the charms of the lady, she was persuaded without much difficulty to lend him the key, but gave him strict orders not to remove anything. The student promised implicit obedience and entered Agrippa's study. The first object that caught his attention was a large grimoire, or book of spells, which lay open on the philosopher's desk. He sat himself down immediately and began to read. At the first word he uttered, he fancied he heard a knock at the door. He listened, but all was silent. Thinking that his imagination had deceived him, he read on, when immediately a louder knock was heard, which so terrified him that he started to his feet. He tried to say, "Come in," but his tongue refused its office, and he could not articulate a sound. He fixed his eyes upon the door, which, slowly opening, disclosed a stranger of majestic form, but scowling features, who demanded sternly, Why he was summoned. "I did not summon you," said the trembling student. "You did," said the stranger, advancing angrily, "and the demons are not to be invoked in vain." The student could make no reply, and the demon, enraged that one of the uninitiated should have summoned him out of mere presumption, seized him by the throat and strangled him. When Agrippa returned a few days afterwards, he found his house beset with devils. Some of them were sitting on the chimney pots, kicking up their legs in the air, while others were playing at leapfrog on the very edge of the parapet. His study was so filled with them that he found it difficult to make his way to his desk. When, at last, he had elbowed his way through them, he found his book open and the student lying dead upon the floor. He saw immediately how the mischief had been done, and dismissing all the inferior imps, asked the principal demon how he could have been so rash as to kill the young man. The demon replied that he had been needlessly invoked by an insulting youth, and could do no less than kill him for his presumption. Agrippa reprimanded him severely, and ordered him immediately to reanimate the dead body and walk about with it in the marketplace for the whole of the afternoon. The demon did so. The student revived, and putting his arm through that of his unearthly murderer, walked very lovingly with him in sight of all the people. At sunset, the body fell down again, cold and lifeless as before, and was carried by the crowd to the hospital, it being the general opinion that he had expired in a fit of apoplexy. His conductor immediately disappeared. When the body was examined, marks of strangulation were found on the neck, and prints of the long claws of the demon on various parts of it. These appearances, together with the story, which soon obtained currency, that the companion of the young man had vanished in a cloud of flame and smoke, opened people's eyes to the truth. The magistrates of Louvain instituted inquiries, and the result was that Agrippa was obliged to quit the town. Other authors besides Del Rio relate similar stories of this philosopher. The world in those days was always willing enough to believe in tales of magic and sorcery, and when, as in Agrippa's case, the alleged magician gave himself out for such and claimed credit for the wonders he worked, it is not surprising that the age should have allowed his pretensions. It was dangerous boasting, which sometimes led to the stake or the gallows, and therefore was thought to be not without foundation. Paulus Jovius, in his Eulogia Doctorum Virorum, says that the devil, in the shape of a large black dog, attended Agrippa wherever he went. Thomas Nash, in his Adventures of Jack Wilton, relates that at the request of Lord Surrey, Erasmus, and some other learned men, Agrippa called up from the grave many of the great philosophers of antiquity, among others Tully, whom he caused to redeliver his celebrated oration for Roscius. He also showed Lord Surrey, when in Germany, an exact resemblance in a glass of his mistress, the fair Geraldine. She was represented on a couch weeping for the absence of her lover. Lord Surrey made a note of the exact time at which he saw this vision, and ascertained afterwards that his mistress was actually so employed at the very minute. To Thomas Lord Cromwell, Agrippa represented King Henry VIII, hunting in Windsor Park with the principal lords of his court, and to please the Emperor Charles V, he summoned King David and King Solomon from the tomb. Naudet, in his Apology for the Great Men Who Have Been Falsely Suspected of Magic, takes a great deal of pains to clear Agrippa from the imputations cast upon him by Del Rio, Paulus Jovius, and other such ignorant and prejudiced scribblers. Such stories demanded refutation in the days of Naudet, but they may now be safely left to decay in their own absurdity. That they should have attached, however, to the memory of a man who claimed the power of making iron obey him when he told it to become gold, and who wrote such a work as that upon magic, which goes by his name, is not at all surprising. This philosopher, called by Naudet the zenith and rising sun of all the alchemists, was born at Einsiedel, near Zurich, in the year 1493. His true name was Hohenheim, to which, as he himself informs us, were prefixed the baptismal names of Aureolus, Theophrastus, Bombastes, Paracelsus. The last of these he chose for his common designation while he was yet a boy, and rendered it, before he died, one of the most famous in the annals of his time. His father, who was a physician, educated his son for the same pursuit. The latter was an apt scholar and made great progress. By chance, the work of Isaac Hollandus fell into his hands, and from that time he became smitten with the mania of the philosopher's stone. All his thoughts henceforth were devoted to metallurgy, and he traveled into Sweden that he might visit the mines of that country and examine the ores while they yet lay in the bowels of the earth. He also visited Trithemius at the monastery of Spanheim, and obtained instructions from him in the science of alchemy. Continuing his travels, he proceeded through Prussia and Austria into Turkey, Egypt, and Tartary, and thence returning to Constantinople. Learned, as he boasted, the art of transmutation, and became possessed of the elixir vitae. He then established himself as a physician in his native Switzerland at Zurich, and commenced writing works upon alchemy and medicine, which immediately fixed the attention of Europe. Their great obscurity was no impediment to their fame, for the less the author was understood, the more the demonologists, fanatics, and philosophers' stone hunters seemed to appreciate him. His fame as a physician kept pace with that which he enjoyed as an alchemist, owing to his having effected some happy cures by means of mercury and opium, drugs unceremoniously condemned by his professional brethren. In the year 1526, he was chosen professor of physics and natural philosophy in the University of Basel, where his lectures attracted vast numbers of students. He denounced the writings of all former physicians as tending to mislead, and publicly burned the works of Galen and Avicenna as quacks and impostors. He exclaimed in presence of the admiring and half-bewildered crowd who assembled to witness the ceremony that there was more knowledge in his shoestrings than in the writings of these physicians. Continuing in the same strain, he said, all the universities in the world were full of ignorant quacks, but that he, Paracelsus, overflowed with wisdom. But he did not long enjoy the esteem of the good citizens of Basel. It is said that he indulged in wine so freely as not unfrequently to be seen in the streets in a state of intoxication. This was ruinous for a physician, and his good fame decreased rapidly. His ill fame increased in still greater proportion, especially when he assumed the airs of a sorcerer. He boasted of the legions of spirits at his command, and of one especially which he kept imprisoned in the hilt of his sword. Wetterus, who lived 27 months in his service, relates that he often threatened to invoke a whole army of demons, and show him the great authority which he could exercise over them. He let it be believed that the spirit in his sword had custody of the elixir of life, by means of which he could make anyone live to be as old as the antediluvians. He also boasted that he had a spirit at his command, called Azoth, whom he kept imprisoned in a jewel, and in many of the old portraits he is represented with a jewel, inscribed with the word Azoth in his hand. If a sober prophet has little honor in his own country, a drunken one has still less. Paracelsus found it at last convenient to quit Basel and establish himself at Strasbourg. The immediate cause of this change of residence was as follows. A citizen lay at the point of death and was given over by all the physicians of the town. As a last resource, Paracelsus was called in, to whom the sick man promised a magnificent recompense, if by his means he were cured. Paracelsus gave him 2 small pills, which the man took and rapidly recovered. When he was quite well, Paracelsus sent for his fee, but the citizen had no great opinion of the value of a cure which had been so speedily effected. He had no notion of paying a handful of gold for 2 pills, although they had saved his life, and he refused to pay more than the usual fee for a single visit. Paracelsus brought an action against him and lost it. This result so exasperated him that he left Basel in high dudgeon. He resumed his wandering life and traveled in Germany and Hungary, supporting himself as he went on the credulity and infatuation of all classes of society. He cast nativities, told fortunes, aided those who had money to throw away upon the experiment, to find the philosopher's stone, prescribed remedies for cows and pigs, and aided in the recovery of stolen goods. After residing successively at Nuremberg, Augsburg, Vienna, and Mindelheim, he retired in the year 1541 to Salzburg, and died in a state of abject poverty in the hospital of that town. If this strange charlatan found hundreds of admirers during his life, he found thousands after his death. A sect of Paracelsists sprang up in France and Germany to perpetuate the extravagant doctrines of their founder upon all the sciences, and upon alchemy in particular. The chief leaders were Bodenstein and Dorneus. The following is a summary of his doctrine, founded upon the supposed existence of the philosopher's stone. It is worth preserving from its very absurdity, and is altogether unparalleled in the history of philosophy. First of all, he maintained that the contemplation of the perfection of the deity sufficed to procure all wisdom and knowledge, that the Bible was the key to the theory of all diseases, and that it was necessary to search into the Apocalypse to know the signification of magic medicine. The man who blindly obeyed the will of God, and who succeeded in identifying himself with the celestial intelligences, possessed the philosopher's stone. He could cure all diseases and prolong life to as many centuries as he pleased, it being by the very same means that Adam and the antediluvian patriarchs prolonged theirs. Life was an emanation from the stars. The sun governed the heart, and the moon the brain. Jupiter governed the liver, Saturn the gall, Mercury the lungs, Mars the bile, and Venus the loins. In the stomach of every human being there dwelt a demon or intelligence that was a sort of alchemist in his way, and mixed in their due proportions, in his crucible, the various elements that were sent into that grand laboratory, the belly. He was proud of the title of magician, and boasted that he kept up a regular correspondence with Galen from hell, and that he often summoned Avicenna from the same regions to dispute with him on the false notions he had promulgated respecting alchemy, and especially regarding potable gold and the elixir of life. He imagined that gold could cure ossification of the heart, and in fact all diseases, if it were gold which had been transmuted from an inferior metal by means of the philosopher's stone, and if it were applied under certain conjunctions of the planets. The mere list of the works in which he advances these frantic imaginings, which he called a doctrine, would occupy several pages. George Agricola. This alchemist was born in the province of Misnia in 1494. His real name was Bauer, meaning a husbandman, which, in accordance with the common fashion of his age, he Latinized into Agricola. From his early youth he delighted in the visions of the Hermetic science. Ere he was 16 he longed for the great elixir which was to make him live for 700 years, and for the stone which was to procure him wealth to cheer him in his multiplicity of days. He published a small treatise upon the subject at Cologne in 1531, which obtained him the patronage of the celebrated Maurice, Duke of Saxony. After practicing for some years as a physician at Joachimsthal in Bohemia, he was employed by Maurice as superintendent of the silver mines of Chemnitz. He led a happy life among the miners, making various experiments in alchemy while deep in the bowels of the earth. He acquired a great knowledge of metals and gradually got rid of his extravagant notions about the philosopher's stone. The miners had no faith in alchemy, and they converted him to their way of thinking, not only in that, but in other respects. From their legends, he became firmly convinced that the bowels of the earth were inhabited by good and evil spirits, and that fire damp and other explosions sprang from no other causes than the mischievous propensities of the latter. He died in the year 1555, leaving behind him the reputation of a very able and intelligent man. Denis Zachary. Autobiography, written by a wise man who was once a fool, is not only the most instructive but the most delightful of reading. Denis Zachary, an alchemist of the 16th century, has performed this task, and left a record of his folly and infatuation in pursuit of the philosopher's stone, which well repays perusal. He was born in the year 1510 of an ancient family in Guyenne, and was early sent to the University of Bordeaux, under the care of a tutor to direct his studies. Unfortunately, his tutor was a searcher for the grand elixir and soon rendered his pupil as mad as himself upon the subject. With this introduction, we will allow Denis Zachary to speak for himself, and continue his narrative in his own words. I received from home, says he, the sum of 200 crowns for the expenses of myself and master. But before the end of the year, all our money went away in the smoke of our furnaces. My master at the same time died of a fever, brought on by the parching heat of our laboratory, from which he seldom or never stirred, and which was scarcely less hot than the arsenal of Venice. His death was the more unfortunate for me, as my parents took the opportunity of reducing my allowance and sending me only sufficient for my board and lodging, instead of the sum I required to continue my operations in alchemy. To meet this difficulty and get out of leading strings, I returned home at the age of 25 and mortgaged part of my property for 400 crowns. This sum was necessary to perform an operation of the science, which had been communicated to me by an Italian at Toulouse, and who, as he said, had proved its efficacy. I retained this man in my service that we might see the end of the experiment. I then, by means of strong distillations, tried to calcinate gold and silver, but all my labor was in vain. The weight of the gold I drew out of my furnace was diminished by 1/2 since I put it in, and my 400 crowns were very soon reduced to 230. I gave 20 of these to my Italian, in order that he might travel to Milan, where the author of the receipt resided, and ask him the explanation of some passages which we thought obscure. I remained at Toulouse all the winter, in the hope of his return, but I might have remained there till this day if I had waited for him, for I never saw his face again. In the succeeding summer there was a great plague which forced me to quit the town. I did not, however, lose sight of my work. I went to Cahors, where I remained 6 months, and made the acquaintance of an old man who was commonly known to the people as the Philosopher, a name which in country places is often bestowed upon people whose only merit is that they are less ignorant than their neighbors. I showed him my collection of alchemical receipts and asked his opinion upon them. He picked out 10 or 12 of them, merely saying that they were better than the others. When the plague ceased, I returned to Toulouse and recommenced my experiments in search of the stone. I worked to such effect that my 400 crowns were reduced to 170. That I might continue my work on a safer method, I made acquaintance in 1537 with a certain abbé who resided in the neighborhood. He was smitten with the same mania as myself, and told me that one of his friends who had followed to Rome in the retinue of the Cardinal d'Armagnac had sent him from that city a new receipt which could not fail to transmute iron and copper, but which would cost 200 crowns. I provided half this money and the abbé the rest, and we began to operate at our joint expense. As we required spirits of wine for our experiment, I bought a ton of excellent vin de Gaillac. I extracted the spirit and rectified it several times. We took a quantity of this into which we put 4 marks of silver and 1 of gold that had been undergoing the process of calcination for a month. We put this mixture cleverly into a sort of horn-shaped vessel with another to serve as a retort, and placed the whole apparatus upon our furnace to produce congelation. This experiment lasted a year, but not to remain idle, we amused ourselves with many other less important operations. We drew quite as much profit from these as from our great work. The whole of the year 1537 passed over without producing any change whatever. In fact, we might have waited till doomsday for the congelation of our spirits of wine. However, we made a projection with it upon some heated quicksilver, but all was in vain. Judge of our chagrin, especially of that of the abbé, who had already boasted to all the monks of his monastery, that they had only to bring the large pump which stood in a corner of the cloister, and he would convert it into gold. But this ill luck did not prevent us from persevering. I once more mortgaged my paternal lands for 400 crowns, the whole of which I determined to devote to a renewal of my search for the great secret. The abbé contributed the same sum, and with these 800 crowns I proceeded to Paris, a city more abounding with alchemists than any other in the world, resolved never to leave it until I had either found the Philosopher's Stone or spent all my money. This journey gave the greatest offense to all my relations and friends, who, imagining that I was fitted to be a great lawyer, were anxious that I should establish myself in that profession. For the sake of quietness, I pretended at last that such was my object. After traveling for 15 days, I arrived in Paris on the 9th of January 1539. I remained for a month almost unknown, but I had no sooner begun to frequent the amateurs of the science and visited the shops of the furnace makers than I had the acquaintance of more than 100 operative alchemists, each of whom had a different theory and a different mode of working. Some of them preferred cementation, others sought the universal alkahest or dissolvent, and some of them boasted the great efficacy of the essence of emery. Some of them endeavored to extract mercury from other metals to fix it afterwards. And in order that each of us should be thoroughly acquainted with the proceedings of the others, we agreed to meet somewhere every night and report progress. We met sometimes at the house of one and sometimes in the garret of another, not only on weekdays but on Sundays and the great festivals of the church. "Ah," one used to say, "if I had the means of recommencing this experiment, I should do something." "Yes," said another, "if my crucible had not cracked, I should have succeeded before now." While a third exclaimed with a, "If I had but had a round copper vessel of sufficient strength, I would have fixed mercury with silver." There was not one among them who had not some excuse for his failure, but I was deaf to all their speeches. I did not want to part with my money to any of them, remembering how often I had been the dupe of such promises. A Greek at last presented himself, and with him I worked a long time uselessly upon nails made of cinnabar or vermilion. I was also acquainted with a foreign gentleman newly arrived in Paris, and often accompanied him to the shops of the goldsmiths to sell pieces of gold and silver, the produce, as he said, of his experiments. I stuck closely to him for a long time, in the hope that he would impart his secret. He refused for a long time, but acceded at last on my earnest entreaty, and I found that it was nothing more than an ingenious trick. I did not fail to inform my friend the abbé, whom I had left at Toulouse, of all my adventures, and sent him, among other matters, a relation of the trick by which this gentleman pretended to turn lead into gold. The abbé still imagined that I should succeed at last and advised me to remain another year in Paris, where I had made so good a beginning. I remained there 3 years, but notwithstanding all my efforts, I had no more success than I had had elsewhere. I had just got to the end of my money when I received a letter from the abbé telling me to leave everything and join him immediately at Toulouse. I went accordingly and found that he had received letters from the King of Navarre. This prince was a great lover of philosophy, full of curiosity, and had written to the abbé that I should visit him at Pau, and that he would give me 3 or 4 thousand crowns if I would communicate the secret I had learned from the foreign gentleman. The abbé's ears were so tickled with the 4,000 crowns that he let me have no peace night or day until he had fairly seen me on the road to Pau. I arrived at that place in the month of May 1542. I worked away and succeeded according to the receipt I had obtained. When I had finished to the satisfaction of the king, he gave me the reward that I expected. Although he was willing enough to do me further service, he was dissuaded from it by the lords of his court, even by many of those who had been most anxious that I should come. He sent me then about my business with many thanks, saying that if there was anything in his kingdom which he could give me, such as the produce of confiscations or the like, he should be most happy. I thought I might stay long enough for these prospective confiscations and never get them at last, and I therefore determined to go back to my friend the abbé. I learned that on the road between Pau and Toulouse there resided a monk who was very skillful in all matters of natural philosophy. On my return I paid him a visit. He pitied me very much and advised me, with much warmth and kindness of expression, not to amuse myself any longer with such experiments as these, which were all false and sophistical, but that I should read the good books of the old philosophers, where I might not only find the true matter of the science of alchemy, but learn also the exact order of operations which ought to be followed. I very much approved of this wise advice, but before I acted upon it, I went back to my abbé of Toulouse to give him an account of the 800 crowns which we had had in common, and at the same time share with him such reward as I had received from the King of Navarre. If he was little satisfied with the relation of my adventures since our first separation, he appeared still less satisfied when I told him I had formed a resolution to renounce the search for the philosopher's stone. The reason was that he thought me a good artist. Of our 800 crowns there remained but 176. When I quitted the abbé, I went to my own house with the intention of remaining there, till I had read all the old philosophers and of then proceeding to Paris. I arrived in Paris on the day after All Saints of the year 1546, and devoted another year to the assiduous study of great authors. Among others, the Turba Philosophorum of the good Trevisan, the Remonstrance of Nature to the Wandering Alchemist, by Jean de Meung, and several others of the best books. But as I had no right principles, I did not well know what course to follow. At last I left my solitude not to see my former acquaintances, the adepts and operators, but to frequent the society of true philosophers. Among them I fell into still greater uncertainties, being in fact completely bewildered by the variety of operations which they showed me. Spurred on, nevertheless, by a sort of frenzy or inspiration, I threw myself into the works of Raymond Lully and of Arnold de Villeneuve. The reading of these and the reflections I made upon them occupied me for another year when I finally determined on the course I should adopt. I was obliged to wait, however, until I had mortgaged another very considerable portion of my patrimony. This business was not settled until the beginning of Lent, 1549, when I commenced my operations. I laid in a stock of all that was necessary and began to work the day after Easter. It was not, however, without some disquietude and opposition from my friends who came about me, one asking me what I was going to do and whether I had not already spent money enough upon such follies. Another assured me that if I bought so much charcoal, I should strengthen the suspicion already existing that I was a coiner of base money. Another advised me to purchase some place in the magistracy, as I was already a doctor of laws. My relations spoke in terms still more annoying to me and even threatened that, if I continued to make such a fool of myself, they would send a posse of police officers into my house and break all my furnaces and crucibles into atoms. I was wearied almost to death by this continued persecution, but I found comfort in my work and in the progress of my experiment, to which I was very attentive and which went on bravely from day to day. About this time there was a dreadful plague in Paris which interrupted all intercourse between man and left me as much to myself as I could desire. I soon had the satisfaction to remark the progress and succession of the 3 colors which, according to the philosophers, always prognosticate the approaching perfection of the work. I observed them distinctly, one after the other, and next year, being Easter Sunday, 1550, I made the great trial. Some common quicksilver, which I put into a small crucible on the fire, was, in less than an hour, converted into very good gold. You may judge how great was my joy, but I took care not to boast of it. I returned thanks to God for the favor he had shown me, and prayed that I might only be permitted to make such use of it as would redound to his glory. On the following day, I went towards Toulouse to find the abbé in accordance with a mutual promise that we should communicate our discoveries to each other. On my way, I called in to see the sage monk who had assisted me with his counsels, but I had the sorrow to learn that they were both dead. After this, I would not return to my own home, but retired to another place to await one of my relations whom I had left in charge of my estate. I gave him orders to sell all that belonged to me, as well movable as immovable, to pay my debts with the proceeds, and divide all the rest among those in any way related to me who might stand in need of it, in order that they might enjoy some share of the good fortune which had befallen me. There was a great deal of talk in the neighborhood about my precipitate retreat, the wisest of my acquaintance imagining that, broken down and ruined by my mad expenses, I sold my little remaining property, that I might go and hide my shame in distant countries. My relative already spoken of rejoined me on the 1st of July, after having performed all the business I had entrusted him with. We took our departure together to seek a land of liberty. We first retired to Lausanne in Switzerland, when, after remaining there for some time, we resolved to pass the remainder of our days in some of the most celebrated cities of Germany, living quietly and without splendor. Thus ends the story of Denis Zachaire as written by himself. He has not been so candid at its conclusion as at its commencement, and has left the world in doubt as to his real motives for pretending that he had discovered the Philosopher's Stone. It seems probable that the sentence he puts into the mouths of his wisest acquaintances was the true reason of his retreat, that he was in fact reduced to poverty, and hid his shame in foreign countries. Nothing further is known of his life, and his real name has never yet been discovered. He wrote a work on alchemy entitled The True Natural Philosophy of Metals. John Dee and Edward Kelly claim to be mentioned together, having been so long associated in the same pursuits and undergone so many strange vicissitudes in each other's society. Dee was altogether a wonderful man, and had he lived in an age when folly and superstition were less rife, he would, with the same powers which he enjoyed, have left behind him a bright and enduring reputation. He was born in London in the year 1527 and very early manifested a love for study. At the age of 15, he was sent to Cambridge and delighted so much in his books that he passed regularly 18 hours every day among them. Of the other 6, he devoted 4 to sleep and 2 for refreshment. Such intense application did not injure his health and could not fail to make him one of the first scholars of his time. Unfortunately, however, he quitted the mathematics and the pursuits of true philosophy to indulge in the unprofitable reveries of the occult sciences. He studied alchemy, astrology, and magic, and thereby rendered himself obnoxious to the authorities at Cambridge. To avoid persecution, he was at last obliged to retire to the University of Louvain. The rumors of sorcery that were current respecting him, rendering his longer stay in England not altogether without danger. He found at Louvain many kindred spirits who had known Cornelius Agrippa while he resided among them, and by whom he was constantly entertained with the wondrous deeds of that great master of the Hermetic mysteries. From their conversation, he received much encouragement to continue the search for the Philosopher's Stone, which soon began to occupy nearly all his thoughts. He did not long remain on the continent, but returned to England in 1551, being at that time in the 24th year of his age. By the influence of his friend Sir John Cheek, he was kindly received at the court of King Edward VI, and rewarded with a pension of 100 crowns. He continued for several years to practice in London as an astrologer, casting nativities, telling fortunes, and pointing out lucky and unlucky days. During the reign of Queen Mary, he got into trouble, being suspected of heresy, and charged with attempting Mary's life by means of enchantments. He was tried for the latter offense and acquitted, but was retained in prison on the former charge and left to the tender mercies of Bishop Bonner. He had a very narrow escape from being burned in Smithfield, but he somehow or other contrived to persuade that fierce bigot that his orthodoxy was unimpeachable, and was set at liberty in 1555. On the accession of Elizabeth, a brighter day dawned upon him. During her retirement at Woodstock, her servants appear to have consulted him as to the time of Mary's death, which circumstance no doubt first gave rise to the serious charge for which he was brought to trial. They now came to consult him more openly as to the fortunes of their mistress, and Robert Dudley, the celebrated Earl of Leicester, was sent by command of the Queen herself to know the most auspicious day for her coronation. So great was the favor he enjoyed that, some years afterwards, Elizabeth condescended to pay him a visit at his house in Mortlake, to view his museum of curiosities, and when he was ill, sent her own physician to attend upon him. Astrology was the means whereby he lived, and he continued to practice it with great assiduity. But his heart was in alchemy. The philosopher's stone and the elixir of life haunted his daily thoughts and his nightly dreams. The Talmudic mysteries, which he had also deeply studied, impressed him with the belief that he might hold converse with spirits and angels, and learn from them all the mysteries of the universe. Holding the same idea as the then obscure sect of the Rosicrucians, some of whom he had perhaps encountered in his travels in Germany, he imagined that, by means of the philosopher's stone, he could summon these kindly spirits at his will. By dint of continually brooding upon the subject, his imagination became so diseased that he at last persuaded himself that an angel appeared to him and promised to be his friend and companion as long as he lived. He relates that one day in November 1582, while he was engaged in fervent prayer, the window of his museum looking towards the west suddenly glowed with a dazzling light, in the midst of which, in all his glory, stood the great angel Uriel. Awe and wonder rendered him speechless, but the angel, smiling graciously upon him, gave him a crystal of a convex form, and told him that whenever he wished to hold converse with the beings of another sphere, he had only to gaze intently upon it, and they would appear in the crystal and unveil to him all the secrets of futurity. Thus saying, the angel disappeared. Dee found from experience of the crystal that it was necessary that all the faculties of the soul should be concentrated upon it, otherwise the spirits did not appear. He also found that he could never recollect the conversations he had with the angels. He therefore determined to communicate the secret to another person, who might converse with the spirit while he sat in another part of the room, and took down in writing the revelations which they made. He had at this time in his service, as his assistant, one Edward Kelly who, like himself, was crazy upon the subject of the philosopher's stone. There was this difference, however, between them, that, while Dee was more of an enthusiast than an impostor, Kelly was more of an impostor than an enthusiast. In early life he was a notary and had the misfortune to lose both his ears for forgery. This mutilation, degrading enough in any man, was destructive to a philosopher. Kelly, therefore, lest his wisdom should suffer in the world's opinion, wore a black skull cap, which, fitting close to his head and descending over both his cheeks, not only concealed his loss but gave him a very solemn and oracular appearance. So well did he keep his secret that even Dee, with whom he lived so many years, appears never to have discovered it. Kelly, with this character, was just the man to carry on any piece of roguery for his own advantage, or to nurture the delusions of his master for the same purpose. No sooner did Dee inform him of the visit he had received from the glorious Uriel, than Kelly expressed such a fervor of belief that Dee's heart glowed with delight. He set about consulting his crystal forthwith, and on the suit of December 1581 the spirits appeared and held a very extraordinary discourse with Kelly, which Dee took down in writing. The curious reader may see this farrago of nonsense among the Harley and Miz in the British Museum. The later consultations were published in a folio volume in 1659 by Dr. Merrick Casaubon, under the title of A True and Faithful Relation of What Passed Between Dr. John Dee and Some Spirits, tending, had it succeeded, to a general alteration of most states and kingdoms in the world. The fame of these wondrous colloquies soon spread over the country and even reached the continent. Dee at the same time pretended to be in possession of the elixir vitae, which he stated he had found among the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey in Somersetshire. People flocked from far and near to his house at Mortlake to have their nativities cast, in preference to visiting astrologers of less renown. They also longed to see a man who, according to his own account, would never die. Altogether, he carried on a very profitable trade, but spent so much in drugs and metals to work out some peculiar process of transmutation that he never became rich. About this time there came into England a wealthy Polish nobleman named Albert Lasky, Count Palatine of Sieradz. His object was principally, he said, to visit the court of Queen Elizabeth, the fame of whose glory and magnificence had reached him in distant Poland. Thank you for watching until the end. If you want to go deep down into the rabbit hole of marketing and persuasion, click the link in the description where you will find many fundamental books about copywriting, psychology, and persuasion. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. See you in the next one.